Hey, it's Nicole at the Pearl Review. How are you? Today I'm excited to talk about John Updike's Rabbit Run. John Updike is considered one of the great American authors of the 20th century. He had some mid-century classics, and he can kind of be lumped in with Saul Bellow and Philip Roth. This book really put John Updike on the map, and it is compassionate and intelligent, and it asks its readers some great questions. So I'm excited to return to this book and return to this series with you. I'm also excited to get back to home turf because I have read some amazing translated classics recently, namely Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and also The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. With Updike, obviously, as a native English speaker, there is no question as to having the undistilled real book in front of me, that there's no question of translation, that this is the whole soul of the book. Now, like many of my reviews, I'm going to do like a quick disclaimer, a brief background and summary of the book, and then get into my favorite takeaways and some analysis. So in terms of disclaimers, this book is very sexual. If you're uncomfortable with that, you might want to skip over it. I think his writing about sex is great. I know that Updike really tried to root his characters in his books in real life, especially the Rabbit Run series. And I think David Foster Wallace once called Updike a phallus with a thesaurus. I can't remember where I heard that, but I just think that that really does a disservice to Updike, because I think he tries to get at real life and meaning, and he's a lot deeper than that. Another disclaimer, the climax of this book has a horrible tragedy. It's a very upsetting thing that happens. If you really are not in the mood for it, I would still consider reading this book, but maybe at another time. And finally, there's some real moments of misogyny in this book, and that's not a reflection on John Updike. He just intentionally created a character that has real flaws to him. And he's not like misogynistic all of the time. He can be a very loving and compassionate person. So this book is the first in a tetralogy, or a series of 4. Updike did not know at the time of making Rabbit Run that he would make this into a series. He was 28 at the time. It was written at the end of the 50s. And by the end of the 60s, in the wake of the protests regarding Vietnam and the riots, he wanted to write a social novel about America, and he chose to return to these characters 10 years later. He does that again in the 70s with Rabbit is Rich. And then at the end of the 80s in Rabbit at Rest. And I think it's really satisfying to follow these characters. So though it's more clear that the second, third, and fourth books in this series were social novels, I think this one was too. He definitely has a lot to say about America in the 50s in this novel. So the summary of this is very simple. Rabbit Angstrom is a 26-year-old former basketball star, and he's married to Janice, who is an alcoholic. She is pregnant, probably midway through her pregnancy of their second child. Their first child, Nelson, is I think between 1 and 2 years old. Now, Rabbit is a fairly ignorant character. He can be fairly stupid, but he has moments of clarity and ambition and real lust for life. And so one day he realizes that he's not really happy with the job that he has, the town that he lives in. He kind of lives in this dreary town city in Pennsylvania. And he finds his life really shabby, especially his marriage. So he decides to just leave everything behind, just to leave his family full stop, no note, no phone call. And the next day he meets this woman named Ruth, who happens to be a prostitute, and they start a relationship. Updike really asks in this book whether Rabbit is a good person despite all the terrible things he does. That's one of the main questions, and the other one is how do we navigate between our freedoms and our duty, our responsibility? In these questions, he also brings up, I think, two major things that were happening in the United States at the time. You had the real weakening of two major institutions in America, namely marriage by way of, I guess, the sexual revolution at the beginning of it, and also this waning influence of the church as well. People become less religious in America through the 20th century. Also, I can't tell for certain, but I think that Updike does satirize American culture in this book. In his interviews, I think he doesn't spell it out because he doesn't want to, he doesn't want to insult anyone. But this book reminded me of Nabokov's Lolita, in that there is some dumb, vulgar Americans in it. But as an American, Updike really cares about his characters. He sneers, I think, at Rabbit, but he also loves him. He loves him enough to make 4 books out of him and a 5th novella including him. And he tried to picture America through the lens of Rabbit Angstrom. And that's part of the reason why people find him such an interesting character. Now, if we were to look at Rabbit Angstrom, I guess what's interesting about him is really our reaction to him. He is such an American. In the sense that he has this real ambition and lust for life. He's trying to figure out his own version of the American dream. However, he can be a little ignorant, and he can be, very self-involved. But at turns he's terribly compassionate, and he has this faith, but his faith is this confusing thing to him because he hasn't really thought it all through. He is this ignorant person that has this relationship with God nonetheless. And so that really causes him to get lost in this book. It causes him to run away and not know where to go. Now, as I said, this book does describe the waning influence of the church. There is a reverend or pastor, PASCAL'S, that tries to revive the marriage between Janice and Rabbit. And PASCAL'S, I think, is very emblematic of that weakening of the church. He is cynical and dark, and he's weak himself. He's either younger or the same age as Rabbit. He's smaller than him, and there's questions to his own, I guess, sexuality in the book that's briefly mentioned. But he is totally inconsequential. He's just kind of following Rabbit along, hoping that he'll be, of some good influence on him. Reminds him that he's done these bad things, but he just seems totally harmless. And the church is never far. Ruth's apartment is actually right across the street from a church. It's this very intentional thing he does. Updike being, as he described in one interview, as a card-carrying Episcopalian. So religion is very important to him, and it definitely has a role in this book, in this questioning whether this person who's done bad things, can he and should he be forgiven? Rabbit as a character is interesting because we're supposed to make a judgment on him, but also he definitely harkens back, I think, to Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye. So he definitely speaks to this sort of rebellious spirit against conformity. He tries to be unconventional, or at least have his moments of it, and try and wake up. I think Rabbit tries to wake up. He tries to, burrow down in his way and get to the depth of reality in this book. Another thing about this book that I really enjoyed, that really was the first thing that I noticed about this book, were Updike's descriptions. I think that's part of his style and his voice. Updike was interested in visual arts and making comics, and he also wrote poetry. So it makes sense to me that his descriptions are brief, poetic, and specific. And I have two great examples here that I'll include as well.
What's this about you being married? Well, I was. Still am. He regrets that they have started talking about it. A big bubble. The enormity of it crowds his heart. It's like when he was a kid and suddenly thought, coming back from somewhere at the end of a Saturday afternoon, that these trees, this pavement was life, the real and only thing. The house shudders to the master's step. Krupenbach comes up the stairs into his den, angry at being taken from his lawn mowing. He wears old black pants and an undershirt soaked with sweat. His shoulders are coated with wiry gray wool. "Hello, Chuck," he says at pulpit volume with no intonation of greeting. His German accent makes his words seem stones, set angrily one on top of another. "What is it?"
So I think it's this, like, the laying down of these stones one on top of the other. I immediately thought of the descriptions. They're really everywhere in this book, and they're really to be savored. I really enjoyed them. Finally, I found some interesting quotes on this book from another article I found on JSTOR, which I will also link below. Apparently the epigraph of this book includes a quote from Pascal, who was a philosopher. And this completely went over my head, but there's a lot of interesting things that this person says about how Pascal's theory about reality and his philosophy is this ironic background to Rabbit Run, and that it's totally intentional. I'm not sure if he completely gets it right, but he has interesting things to say. I listened to a lot of interviews from John Updike in researching for this book review, and he does mention that, you know, this book is about a character who is emblematic of, like, America's obsession with youth. You know, he gets scared after his, you know, great success, you know, early on in his life, and he no longer finds his wife attractive, and you know, he gets scared of everything and runs away because he thinks everything's going downhill. And also he's very entitled because he is of the generation that is the post-World War II generation in America. Now, if you're not American, this is considered like the great generation. You know, the world is theirs. So he just assumes that his mediocre life is this total waste of time. And there is something empathetic, you know, about him, because he tries to make his life better, but he's foolish. He does these crazy things in trying to figure out what to do next. So without further ado, here's some great quotes that a scholar had in relating Rabbit's behavior with major philosophers. In Rabbit Run, the epigraph points to the whole of Pascal's PENSÉES, which form an ironic backdrop to Rabbit's story. The idea of the basketball player, sketched in earlier Updike pieces such as Ex-Basketball Player and Ace in the Hole, is in Rabbit Run placed in the philosophical context of Pascal's thought. The duality of Rabbit's character, the atmosphere of moral ambiguity in which he makes his choices, the unreliability of his instincts, the resulting anxiety, all are characteristics of man as Pascal describes him, fallen from grace yet moved toward God. The ambiguity that critical interpretation sees in the character of Rabbit Angstrom is consonant with Pascal's central idea, man's inevitable duality. Critics tend to see Rabbit as either saint or sinner, either an earnest but immature social misfit or a questing man, whose peculiar saintliness excuses behavior that might be condemned in others. As Updike himself points out, there is a certain ambiguity. I don't wish my fiction to be any clearer than life. This condition of being free and bound, limited and limitless, is the cause of Rabbit's angst. The idea of man's dual nature and the conflict and anxiety thus resulting can be traced to Pascal. In the PENSÉES, man is rather like a ruined or disinherited nobleman, cast out from the kingdom which ought to have been his. Thus, Pascal takes as a fundamental premise the image of a man as a disinherited being. Surely Rabbit is Pascal's disinherited man, failed, fallen from the glory of his high school basketball career, and it is a horrible thing to feel all that we possess slipping away. So like I said, I think this is a very interesting book. Thanks for listening. If you have read this, if you have any questions or thoughts or takeaways, please comment below, and yeah, take care. Bye.